So I'll start off by saying, Justin McCoy, Mississippi State University. I'm here today with Mr. Jack Herkamp, farmer down in Knoxville County, Mississippi. We would like to thank the National Conservation Systems Cotton and Rice Conference for having us speak at this event. We're going to start off today. Jack's going to talk a little bit about some of the cover crops on his farm. I'm going to follow it up a little bit about corn fertility here in Mississippi and kind of where I think, our fertility programs, we'll go with cover crops in Mississippi and kind of how those rotations and fertility fit into Mississippi corn production. So if we'll go ahead and start with Jack, if you would, and thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Justin. For my crop rotation that we do, just to touch on it just a little bit, generally I'm 50-50 cotton and corn. In that rotation, we have been more cotton the last several years, just as the economic thing. We've been making more money on the cotton than the corn, so we've been pushing it. Looking at yields coming off the rotation with corn almost always makes more behind cotton than it is corn behind corn. Now, I haven't had corn behind corn in several years now, but in the past and what I've seen, it's a plus for the corn crop to keep it in the rotation behind cotton. Cotton's a little bit different story. Cotton is more of a mix. I went through a bunch of my years and wrote it down, every field, what it made and what crop was in front of it, and studied up on it. And I've never really done this kind of opportunity to look at that, to really truly look at it. And I had some years where the cotton behind corn compared to the cotton behind cotton was more. It was 100, 150, maybe 200 pounds better on the fields that were behind corn than the cotton that was behind cotton. And then I looked at other years, and every year is different, and it makes a huge difference. I had more of a mix in the cotton behind cotton compared to the cotton behind corn. So in the overall average, I would say cotton behind corn had a little edge on yield, just depending on the year.
Right.
Definitely still something you want to do. You want to keep breaking it up. On our fertilizer program that we're using right now for the two crops, we're going by our soil samples to see what we need and what we need where. The fertilizer in the fall goes out for the corn according to what it needs that following year. For the cotton, we're putting out what cotton needs for the following year. And then you've got your basics there where you're trying to keep building soil that you're going to do one way or another. And then we kind of touch it for whichever crop is following in the next year. Most of my fertilizer right now is going out in a kipper with a Valmar attachment to it to put it out in the row. So it's going in the row as we're hipping. I like that system. It's giving me all that right there where it's working into the hip. And then behind that, we are doing a prescription for either the P or the K, the phosphate or the potash, according to what we need. So some fields get it, some fields don't. But we do broadcast that application to fill in and start trying to even our fields out a little bit. Bring it down, bring it to where every acre is the same, which is what we're looking for.
Right.
On the cover crops then, as we get into it, we've been 100% cover crop now for several years, 5-6 years now, probably. Cover crop on every acre. Some acres a little more successful than others. You get a wet year and you can't get finished up in the fall. It's kind of hard to get a stand. So we've had that kind of problem, but it looks, we love our cover crops. We like what we're doing. I've touched on cover crops since 1992. So we kind of did a little here. We did a little there, some success, some failures. My one in 92 was an absolute success. We liked what we did. So we continue to work on it to the point where we feel like we're real comfortable at 100% cover crop on our acres. We start off behind corn after corn harvest. I've gotten where I really like more of a blend of oats and cereal rye, and then maybe oats, cereal rye, and some crimson clover to go with it. We've done a little bit of radishes, a little bit of turnips. We're still playing, still finding what we like, what we think is the best thing to put out there. And I don't know if there's a best thing. I think it's kind of just different things are good.
Right.
So that's the direction we're headed right now. The corn. Okay, so we're going to want to let her cut this out just a moment here. Yeah. So I'm going to go into my cotton first. This is a field in 2016. It was just an excellent example of making a cover crop work and going into cotton. So I like this one. This was a rye oats blend with crimson clover, and I did a better job of getting my crimson clover up this year. You see you got it spread out there pretty good. You see with my son's golden retriever, he's a big dog. This is pretty good cover crop. It's up about the light height that we have, and I think along in here is when we burned it down. Actually, some of that's a little too tall. I don't like to let my grasses, my rye, and my oats get to head, and I like to take them down before they get that far, just to keep them from standing so bad. So if you kill them before they get a good stalk on it, they'll break down and hit the ground quicker, which is what you really need in a cotton crop. And I will say I let some get too big. This past year, we ran a shredder through it and brought them down to the road, and that worked a lot nicer. There is a problem with a cover crop this tall planting cotton into it because it shades the cotton crop. I did some experimenting with it several years ago, and I had some waist tall, and it lost 1 to 2 nodes behind the crop that was burnt down earlier. 1 to 2 nodes is a lot. It's making you later, and it definitely lost yield on it. So that was too far. Now this is what it looked like after it was burnt down. This is planted, kind of hard to see it. So right here, now you can see them. They're there, and it's a good stand out there. It doesn't look like it till you get down into it.
Right.
You just drive up to the field, and you go, there's nothing out there. It took till June till I could drive this field and see cotton looking across the rows to find it. So she's coming on pretty nice. Coming on a little bit. Now you can see it. Now the cover crop's breaking down, and the cotton's growing on through it. And right here, we're getting into maybe the July, early August time frame, and you can't tell there's a cover crop out there right now. This is defoliate cotton, and this is exactly the place that we were looking at taking these other pictures. So this looks nice. I'm really proud of how this worked out. Final yield on it, we're right there. The monitor was actually in this field pretty close when we got it ginned, and I looked at exactly what it made. For where I was picking right there, that's where the average would be. The field did not quite do 2 bale, but the field kind of tapered off. And really, as you can see on the map, the field's tapering off a little bit on yield. We were running over 4 bale.
Right, yeah.
Got to change that. We were over 4 bale. 2,000 pounds is what I was thinking, but we went over 4 bale on this block right here. And then as I finished the field, it dropped down a little bit. I can't ask for any more than what this gave to me. My corn crop, this is 2020 corn crop now. I've been trying to plant my corn into a green cover crop. I like it. The planter cuts through the green better than it does a bunch of dry stalk. This did have a dew-all across it to kind of try to open up these beds just a little bit, and it helps. But this corn came on pretty nice. That's the planter going through, and you can see it's making its way. It's getting seed in the ground. That was a different field, a different year. Same thing. Now you see this corn is coming on through it rather nicely. And this stuff was, most of that cover crop was knee-high when I planted this corn. So it was burnt down the day before or the day after the planter went through the field. So it's right there. So it was definitely plenty green when we planted this crop.
All right.
And we had to stand. We consistently yielded across this field in this situation right here.
That's what you want.
That's what I want. Because we want yield in the end to match anything that you did before or more. And I will say on top of that, I have had a good bit of cover crop now in dryland fields. This, of course, is an irrigated field. I do feel like in a dryland field, a good cover crop, if you get it handled right, increases yield in a dry year.
Yeah.
Definitely. Makes a difference.
Good. That's what we're trying to do, right?
That's what we had it for.
Well, Jack, I appreciate that. Thank you for telling us a little bit about that. I had the opportunity to come down there and see your operation the other day, and let me tell you, I was very impressed. I think you got the cover crop thing figured out, and so now I'm going to talk a little bit about corn fertility in Mississippi and kind of how I see that fitting in with the cover crops and these cover crop production systems. And vice versa. And after that, me and Jack will have a little bit of a discussion. I know I have a bunch of questions for him after hearing that and also seeing his operation. Well, again, thank you, Jack. As I said, my name's Justin McCoy. I am assistant professor at Mississippi State University at the North Mississippi Research and Extension Center. Today, I'm going to touch a little bit on corn fertility here in Mississippi, and also kind of how does that play into our upcoming cover crop systems and vice versa. So cover crop use trends throughout Mississippi, I came, and the USDA, the last stuff they had out and published was the data from 2017. And in Mississippi in 2017, we had about 140,000 acres of cover crops that year. So that would encompass a little over 4% of our total acreage, which is actually fairly good. But what I thought really stuck out was we were number 5 on the list of increasing in trends. So from 2016 to 2017, we jumped up 111%. And I feel that trend has increased a little bit. I know that you've been doing it for a long time, Jack. But, me personally, and I don't know about yourself, but I know probably 3 or 4 more guys who had 0 back in 2017 who are at least trying it. So I think that it is gaining traction here in our state. I know that, maybe farther north, it's gained a little bit more traction, but even here in the Mid-South, I think people are really gaining more interest, and we're moving more into that. So, with that said, I think that, we need to know that not only how to treat these cover crops, but how do we take all the knowledge that we've learned from, without cover crops and really apply it into those scenarios? How do we fit what we're doing today into a profitable system that's also sustainable for years to come? So on the fertility side of things, I like to look at, what's in a corn bushel. So what are you actually carrying out of the field every year? What's going in your trucks, going in your bins? What are you carrying to the elevator? So this was data, and if you've got a yield of about 180 bushels of corn, you are taking 63 pounds of P2O5 off that field every year and about 45 pounds of K2O. Another thing that we really look at is over here, if you see the sulfur, that's 14 pounds of sulfur that you're carrying off that field. I know our cotton guys, they're normally pretty good about putting sulfur out there because they understand the need for that crop. But, when you've got a different rotation, you haven't been growing cotton. I see a lot of it this year. We actually had a pretty bad sulfur problem on our farm up in Verona this year, which I was impressed. It was actually some of the worst I've ever seen. So not proud to be a part of that, but, we're learning from that. And we try to correct that this year. But, and then you go all the way up to, over 200 bushels, you're talking about 75 pounds of P and about 53 pounds of K, going out of that field every year in your crop. And, as we get into these grain-based systems, we're removing a lot more of these nutrients every year. And as we continue to increase our yields, one of the things we need to pay attention to is our base fertility program enough? I know you talk about your soil sample every year, and a lot of guys do. And, I think that, I'll always push soil sampling, and that's very important. But, there may be, some guys may just be, I'm going to put out 100 pounds of potash and 100 pounds of phosphorus, and I'm not going to worry about it, and that should be enough. Well, that's one of those things that, if you're pushing these high yields, we really may need to rethink what you think we're taking out of those fields. And it's really just something to be aware of. Kind of the reason I say that is looking at these. So these graphics basically depict our fertilizer use trends in Mississippi. So on the left, we would have our potassium use trends, and on the right, our phosphorus. And I didn't include the legend here, but basically the way it is your pink, your white would be basically your neutral. So we're about even. We're about putting back what we're taking out. Your pink, you're taking out a little over a pound more than you're putting back. And your red, you're somewhere in 3 to 4. The green, you're actually putting more than we're taking out. So it looks like, in those counties, those are really the counties in Mississippi where we have a lot of hay production. We're spreading a lot of chicken litter. So we're actually putting a little bit more back into our fields down there. But if you look in our major agricultural areas, the Delta, and then over here in the prairie of Mississippi and on up through the northern portion of the state, we're not doing a very good job. You can see that both of those are trending the opposite direction. We're really taking more out of our fields than we're putting in. And, this isn't just on your farm, Jack. This would be overall. So those numbers that I have up there in the top underneath the potassium, the K2O, minus 125,000. So that is the United States as a whole. In 2017, I think it was, we were negative 125,000 tons of potassium, what we were taking out of our soils versus what we were putting back. So that's pretty impressive. Phosphorus kind of followed that as we were negative 47,000 tons. So, United States agriculture as a whole, we're taking a lot more out of our soils than we're putting back every year. If you look at the historical data from that, it really took a turn for the worst, I would say, in 2007 when fertilizer prices kind of skyrocketed. Urea went above $400. People have just been, I don't know if hesitant is the right word or just haven't done it. But, as crop prices change, fertility is sometimes the forgotten thing out there. It's one of those things that it may not be jumping out of your face, but it's important for us to just remember these things and make sure we're doing a good job of that. And so fertilizer and cover crops, as we, not only do we need to be doing a good job of putting these, back into our soils, but how do we do this with cover crops and how might these cover crops affect our fertility programs that we're doing now? In Mississippi, I think that we have a lot to learn, especially on my end. I know in my program, we're just starting to really get into the applicable side. There's a lot of people at Mississippi State who have done a good job at getting us there. But I think in the future, we've got a lot to learn to help you out on your farm. Today, I want to talk a little bit about a lot of the fertility aspects that we've learned without cover crops and kind of how I think and where we need to go from here. How, when we go through it, maybe think about kind of how cover crops may affect that, may change that differently. But, a little bit, some of the previous research that's been done, around, so in Brazil, Carvalho, they ran a study and they suggested that the mineralization of the nutrients from their cover crop residue were actually able to maintain their corn yields in Brazil. So within that study, they were able to maintain yields just equal to, using synthetic fertilizer just by having those cover crops out there in the field. In 95, Hutchinson in Alabama reported that 34% nitrogen was actually needed by a cotton crop the following year when a winter cover crop was used compared to a fallow field. Now, I think both of these studies are probably on extreme ends. Obviously, it can happen as it was reported here. I hope that, that we don't have to put 30% more nitrogen out there on our crops. And also, it would be great if, a cover crop could keep those yields, but there's only so much in the soil. And, eventually that's going to be exhausted as we continue to increase these yields. So, our biggest question is how do cover crop systems and species are going to affect our fertility needs in the future and as we move into these systems? As I said before, as we go through these, I'd like, maybe kind of think about how these could be implemented in a cover crop system and how that cover crop may change this. So the first thing I want to talk a little bit about, this was done in the Delta while I worked under Dr. Bobby Golden. This is some data he had. And basically what we did is we wanted to, I guess, look at our soil test in Mississippi. At Mississippi State, when you send a soil test off and you got it back and you got a recommendation to fertilizer, we said that your soil was low in a nutrient and we expected a response to that nutrient. One, did we get a response and were those ranges accurate? So what we did here is over about 4 or 5 years, we had, I think, 45 sites for both of these on-farm sites. These soil samples were sent off, and then based on those results, they were placed into an either responsive or a non-responsive category. So a responsive category would have been those sites that came back as they tested as low or very low and in need of a nutrient at those sites. The non-responsive sites would have been those that tested medium or high, claiming you had enough nutrients in your soil for that crop. And what we saw was that, our soil testing lab, we had done a good job. It kind of verified, and validated what we do there. So looking at potassium applications, we had a stepwise rate through there. But our responsive sites, We saw yield increases of 20% or 38 bushels an acre just by putting potassium on those sites where it said we needed to. So, not only are we low in those nutrients, you also should see an economic return on your investment due to those sites. And with potassium, on average, it took about 80 pounds to really reach that maximum. Now, obviously, this can change across site, but that was just the average over the sites that we tested. Looking at phosphorus is kind of the same trend. So at these responsive sites, we saw yield increases of 11% or 20 bushels an acre just by adding phosphorus to those systems where it said we needed it. So, again, like I said, it's really just validated that these soil tests, that they are accurate and that, you should expect to see not only a yield increase, but an economic return on these investments when you put the nutrients out there that corn needs. So another test that we did in 2015 and 2016, this was done in the Delta again under Dr. Golden. In this test, the main goal of this test was really to look at some of the newer fertilizer blends that had come out with some of the micronutrients, really to see, were we getting response from those. And so this, again, was on a site that, it did test low for phosphorus and potassium, so we did expect to see a response. So in this, we had a nitrogen only where we didn't have any phosphorus, potassium. We had muriate of potash and monoammonium phosphate as our, as our regular blend, just supplying potassium and phosphorus out there. And then on top of that, we had some of the newer compounds that supplied some of those micronutrients to the equation. And what we saw across both years was that base corn fertility was really the key to reaching those high yields. We did see a little bit of an increase, from the base fertility, especially in 2016, to some of those micronutrients. And those micronutrients are extremely important, and you can see yield increases from it. But our biggest jump was just by having the proper phosphorus and potassium out there. So in 2015, we went from 224 to 240 bushels just by having the proper phosphorus and potassium application. In 2016, similar, went from 209 to 250 bushels, just by having your base corn fertility that you needed out there. And so building upon that, as I've recently moved into a role at the North Mississippi Research and Extension Center, we really want to take this increase in cover crops and find out, how does it affect our fertility programs? So this is a picture here. It's not quite as big as some of the cover crops that Jack seed and showed. And as I saw down at his operation, we got these planted this fall. This is a study that we began up there. And basically the premise of this study is it was placed in a field that does test low for phosphorus and potassium. So we would expect or hope to see a response due to those applications. So in this field, basically we had 4 cover crop species. We had winter wheat, cereal rye, tillage radish, and then we had crimson clover. Within each of those, we either applied a fall fertility program or we did not. So in that fall fertility program, it was either phosphorus or potassium. Essentially what we were hoping to achieve in this, and then we also had a no cover crop control that also had the phosphorus or potassium split in it. Essentially what we wanted to achieve with this study is we want to look at, number one is planting that cover crop. Can we get a yield boost? Will it be able to mine for some of the nutrients and allow for it to be available to your cash crop the next year? So if we plant that cover crop, even if we don't fertilize, can it bring some of those nutrients to the surface and scavenge a little bit? And would we get a yield increase where we might, see that? We would expect a response. And then the second thing that we really wanted to look at was how does this interaction affect one another? So, if you have a cover crop and you're applying your fall fertilizer, as that fertilizer breaks down over the fall, these cover crops are more than likely taking up these available nutrients, So how does that interact with your cash crop next year, and how's the availability to that? I think that, what we learned in the past is kind of, we want to take that into the future and really apply it and kind of figure out, how these cover crops might affect what we need to do moving forward. So that's just a little bit about what we're doing up there as we move into these cover crops and looking at it in corn and other crops. Kind of moving on from the base fertility thing, the next thing I kind of want to talk about was our high yield management options. I know, Jack, that, you've got some really high yields down there and you're really bumping it every year, and as we continue, we've learned a lot, and we have learned, how can we gain a few extra bushels here and there. So this was a study that was carried out 17 and 18, again in Stoneville, Mississippi. And what we wanted to look at here is we wanted to look at some of these high yielding management options, such as some of the micronutrients that we saw earlier, and then we also wanted to look at some of the proactive fungicide applications and foliar fertilizer applications in corn. So this is kind of a busy slide here, but basically what we had is your management program one consisted of just phosphorus and potassium with actually no nitrogen fertilizer. So we wouldn't expect anyone to do that, but we kind of wanted to include it as a check. Two is what we would consider the grower standard. So all of the nitrogen was applied at planting via UAN with the knife rig, and it also included the phosphorus and potassium fertilizer on those plots. And from there, it kind of built upon one another. So with management program 3, really all it did was split that nitrogen application to an at plant and a V4 application. And then from there with 4, we kind of moved into some of the micronutrients, adding some zinc and some boron into those. And then 5 and 6 included, 5 had a fungicide treatment at tassel, and then 6 had fungicide treatment and foliar fertilizer. And so we broke that down into the additional cost above what we call the grower standard or management program number 2. We looked at this. Grain yield was significantly influenced, as well as your economic return difference. So first, looking at grain yield. So again, number 2 would have been our grower standard. Above that, when you look and you get into the management program 4, 5, and 6, we did see a significant yield increase over these management programs. So we were able to increase our yield, putting those micronutrients, putting those fungicide and foliar fertilizers out there into that field. We did see a slight yield increase due to that. Obviously, with corn management program 1, where we did not include any nitrogen, it was significantly lower, which we would expect. But the main thing here was, we wanted to look at the net return difference. So, okay, we can increase yield a little bit, but how does that play economically? And I know this was some rough economics. Some of the economists out there may not appreciate the slide, but so we wanted to look at the net return difference compared to that base management program, which we determined to be number 2. So with management program 1, where you didn't apply any nitrogen, you lost a bunch of money. I wouldn't recommend you doing that. But what I really want to focus on here is management program 4, 5, and 6. So I do want to point out that this is in hectares, so you can divide this by about 2.5 to get back to acreage. But with those, we did not see any increases, economically return-wise from this yield increase. And actually with management program 6, we saw a significant yield decrease. So, the main thing to point out there is, or we want to look at is that, yes, we were able to increase it, but when you add that many trips across the field, that many more products, even though we got a small yield increase, really it's important economically to look at those yield increases and, can I get that every year? Now, I do believe, that was a very small margin there. I think that, micronutrients are important when you need them. We were able to do that, and I think we want to continue on that, but it's just something to keep in mind are the economics of those things and those programs. And so the last thing I want to touch on here is corn seeding rate. And really I included this because we've been doing it. I think it's important, and I want to talk to you a little bit to you, Jack, afterwards about this. But these seeding rates and getting these populations in these cover crops, stand. And so this was started by Dr. Dennis Reginelli in 2019, and then we continued it this year in 2020 at Verona. This was done on 38-inch raised bed row spacing in a dry land environment. So there we picked 5 of the highest yielding corn hybrids from our MSU demo every year. And we had 3 seeding rates both years. So in 2019, we had 3 seeding rates, 28, 31, and 34,000 seed per acre. In 2020, we had 28,000, 32,000, 36 seed per acre. And so, our recommended in our area for most hybrids falls in that 30 to 34,000 range. Some of them are a little bit higher than that. But that's where a lot of the producers in our area are. So in 2019, seeding rate and corn hybrid had significant influence on grain yield. And in 2020, both of those, as well as the interaction amongst them, had an influence on grain yield. For the purposes of this, I did not include that hybrid by seeding rate interaction. there are some known, differences among hybrids and how they should interact, but I didn't include it in this program. So looking at corn seeding rate and how that influenced grain yield, on the left we have 2019, on the right we have 2020. So in 2019, we had significantly greater yield with the 34,000 seed per acre than both 28,000 and 31,000. And actually from our lowest at 28,000, we were about almost 30 bushels greater just by having a higher seeding rate across these corn hybrids. Now in 2020, we did not see a difference in 28 or 32,000 seed per acre, but 36,000 seed per acre was actually significantly higher than both of those. Our yields were a little bit down due to some drought conditions this year, but it is interesting that we did see that we never really plateaued out. So in the future, I think we want to continue this, as corn hybrids continually evolve. We want to find that optimum rate in our area. And on top of that, I think we're going to add a little bit, see if we can't find that plateau of in between where that optimum area is. Within that test, corn hybrid significantly influenced grain yield. I think that's been shown, time and time again that, hybrid selection can have a big impact, on your corn yield. In this situation, from our lowest to our highest in both years is about 25 bushels. So, that's something that we're doing right now, getting our corn seed booked, and that's an extremely important decision every year. I know Mississippi State does a great job with their demo program. I know a lot of universities around the Southeast do. So I think it's important to be in the know about, what hybrids perform the best in your area and in your conditions. So the last thing here, again, going back to economics quickly. So with these seeding rates in 2019, on the far right, we have the return above the seed cost at $3.60 a bushel. So that was about the average I got for our corn prices sold this year. And again, that is simply above seed cost. It doesn't include any of the other, but that's just to start. So in 2019, from 28,000 to 34,000, the difference in the return above seed cost was about $125 an acre. So that's pretty significant, that your starting budget is $100 greater just on what seeding rate you choose. Again, in 2020, we were about, our yields were a little bit closer together, but we were about $30 an acre just on that seeding rate. So again, as I said, we want to continue this, and we really, I'd like to move into seeing, with these cover crops, how do we ensure that we have these live seed out there, and how do we make sure that we have the optimum stand and optimum corn density that we need to have out there year in and year out. And so, a quick conclusion on kind of, I know that was a lot on kind of that is, again, base fertility has been, in our research is the key to corn yields in Mississippi. Having the right amount of the nutrients out there, P and K, especially when you need it, you're not going to get to the yield levels that you want without having that. And then how will these cover crop species, as we continue to move into that, affect our fertility programs, especially our fall programs? Do we need to be putting more out there? Could we cut back? How do we split that? And, when will it be available for that cash crop? And then lastly, economics will drive our cover crops and fertility decisions. We want to get to a place where, we're not only increasing our yields, but we're economically profitable at the end of the year. And, Jack, that's what, during this discussion, I want to talk to you because I think, you've done a good job with, not only increasing your yields using cover crops, but also making it economically viable for you and your operation. And so with that, I think that I'd like to have, I know I've got plenty of questions for you, Jack. As I said, I was able to see your operation last week. And I think that, from here on out for the rest of the time, I think we can just talk a little bit. I know I've got some questions. Hopefully you have some questions for me. And we appreciate the people watching this. And, hopefully they can learn a little bit from this. So I appreciate you sitting there and getting through that.
Uh-huh.
But, I know that we had talked a little bit. I was able to come down there last week. But, and you touched a little bit on your fertility program and how you've been doing it. And, you've been soil sampling doing that. But, I'll start off. I know, one of the big things I saw in your operation was, you had a lot of equipment that is not necessarily the norm for this area. You've moved to a lot of precision equipment. What do you think probably would you say was the most important piece of equipment implement that you to be able to make the cover crops work for your operation? And then, just a little bit about some of the equipment and how you've made that work and you feel like it's really helped you along with the cover crops.
Well, course, when you're planting into a cover crop, the planter is everything. And we do run the do-all in front of it, try to even things out just a little bit and help it. But the do-all doesn't always do a lot with the cover. If you got a heavy cover crop, it'll tend to ride on top. But it'll give you a little bit. So the planter is everything.
Right.
The biggest thing that I've added to the planter, and this is something that you can, I'll fight you to take it off of it. My Delta Force, which is a hydraulic downforce. So it's giving each row, because it'll vary across your planter a lot of times. The Delta Force will adjust each row. And when I'm looking at my iPad sitting beside me there on the tractor, I see that. I see different rows doing different. It really needs downforce, consistent downforce, to keep your coulters cutting into the ground, to get that consistent depth that you've got to have with corn. And really, cotton, folks think is an easy thing, but I plant my cotton the way I plant corn. I want consistent depth. I want it in moisture, and I want consistent spacing in my cotton crop also. Right. It's not something you think of, but I'm talking to a lot of guys that are the same way. And to get their highest yields, they're going out there. If it's consistently spaced cottonseed and consistently emerging,
right,
compared to a cornfield, it's increasing my yields. So it's important no matter what crop you're in. It's making a lot of difference. So the downforce, keeping it in the ground, is a big thing. And also the floating trash managers that I put on my planter. Those two things are really critical.
Yeah.
The floating trash manager from the tractor, you can sit there and you can bump it. You're not moving quite enough. You're not going, I can get through the field if I have to get off and adjust them. I'm not going to do it quite as quick. When they're floating, you sit there and you bump it a little bit and you look back and you see you're getting what you want. So those two things are really critical.
Right.
Just got to have them. Planting into green, we talked about, I don't think I touched on this before.
Yeah.
On a green cover crop, it just cuts into it so much better than a dry, heavy cover crop that's dead and brown.
Okay.
Green stuff cuts through it like it's not there. So that's where I really like planting corn into a green cover crop.
Preferably over one
I
that's
prefer
just
it, yeah. It depends on how the year is. Sometimes if you get a little later, you're going to have to burn the cover crop down because it's going to dry you out too fast. But definitely makes a difference.
So so you feel with that precision planter, you feel comfortable planting into that green cover crop, and you're killing that cover crop with your burn down and pre for the corn behind the planter or just behind.
That's right. When we talk about, I started cover crops, my first really successful cover crop in 1992. That's a long way, 28 years ago. And I made a good yield on my cotton that year. I loved it. But getting just that right condition. So that year I had just the right conditions for the planter I had, and I got the cotton in the ground and I got it up. That's been the struggle, is having a planter that can handle the cover crop and handle, sometimes might be a tighter soil, but when you're planting green, it's almost better than dead the soil itself is. It's a little looser because it's got the live roots down in there.
Right.
But getting a planter that can plant into the heavy cover crops it's allowed me to plant the cover crops. That's been the difference. Right there.
Yeah. And, with that, we showed some of the seeding rates. I know that, you may be even higher than that in some instances, which is, kind of touched on, how does that, fitting that in with cover crops and making sure, as you said, with the planter, that you're getting a good stand, because, that's the beginning of everything.
That's the beginning. Yeah. When the planter goes through the field, that's what your whole crop depends on, what it did.
Right. And, that leads me right into, I had a question. I was impressed with some of your pictures of how big you let some of the cover crops get. I know you say you like to kill it before heading, but, a lot of the operations I've seen, the guys I've seen running cover crops before, just get nervous about them getting that big for one, and just have had trouble with them when they get that big, and so that planter is certainly important, and being able to do that, and then on that, do you feel that you want them to get that big in order to really get the benefits out of them? Does that make any sense to you?
Absolutely. You want them to get that big. That way you're building the biomass that you're wanting out there. You're building the erosion control that you're going to get, and it's just a huge difference on erosion control. And I'm planting in a pure clay soil. It's a lot harder to work with. I've noticed since I've got a few fields that have been consistent good cover crop for probably 10 years now. When I walk those fields compared to a turn row, or especially a road where you don't have anything growing all the time,
Right.
you walk through clay, you get bigger and bigger and bigger. I walk my fields now, I can absolutely tell the difference of the stickiness of the clay, which means I'm building that organic matter out there, and I'm building soil tilt out there, so
Right.
it's not as sticky. There's a difference.
Yeah.
If I can walk a field and almost come out with clean boots sometime and just behind the rain,
Pretty good.
I mean, that puts a smile on my face.
Yeah.
I'm doing what I want to do.
That's
So I'm seeing a huge benefit, not just erosion, but organic matter and tilt behind my consistent cover crops. Definitely.
Yeah, and that's exactly where you want to be.
Where we're headed. Yeah.
I know that. And, leading that, kind of continuing on that, down here in the South and in our area, it seems like every year, as we try and plant corn, we want to be earlier and earlier, but, we get these heavy rains and, it just feels like, our corn, we got 1-2 weeks maybe sometimes to really get a bulk of our crop planted when we want to, if that makes any sense. I think, some of the, a lot of the concerns are with, being able to get in that field. How have you seen that, especially on your heavier soils? Mm-hmm. Have you seen that affect your fields? How do you feel that those cover crops are, I guess, affecting your ability to get in there and get that corn planted in a timely fashion?
Yeah, I think it's been aiding me on getting in a timely fashion. I've had somebody tell me that they just never found a field where they're planting a green cover crop and it was drier. I have seen that, or I'm into the field a day, and sometimes you only get 2 days to plant,
right,
and you get another rain. If I get an extra day, that's a big thing. But I have seen a green cover crop give me an extra day of where it dried out, where I can get in the field and plant, and it plants nice. Now, that's planting into a green cover crop. Or I'm killing a cover crop and I've got a real heavy cover crop going into a cotton crop.
Right.
I have had a heavy crop keep the soil wet where it takes longer to dry out. And it has hindered me. One thing we did this last year is the first time we did it, where we got a little too big. And of course, I've been learning from the past years, a big crop and you plant cotton into it is not working out, because I can get it up, but it doesn't grow off because it's got so much shading effect from something that's this tall beside that little bitty tiny cotton plant. Corn kind of goes through it. It grows up and it'll come up through it so much faster. Cotton just takes forever. We did run a shredder across it and knocked it down. We shaved it down to the height of what that cotyledon's going to be when it comes out of the ground. And I tell you what,
pleased with that.
I was real pleased with that.
Yeah.
So if you do get in trouble, let it go a little long. There is an answer to it. It's another trip through the field, but another trip through the field is a whole lot better than having something where you're getting hurt.
Absolutely.
You can get through it.
Absolutely. And then, I guess on your fertility programs, especially, I guess, one thing I really didn't touch on in my presentation, I guess, as much is nitrogen needs throughout the year. You're in the interesting situation, which, I want to get to as well, but, you're not having any legumes essentially in your rotation, so you're in all crops that have, most of your cash crops are, nitrogen needing crops. Have you seen where do you have to make a difference, a change with those, and how have you felt about being able to get the nitrogen out there when you need it?
Yeah, with the cover crops, and we really need to do a lot of work with studying on when we need to nitrate out there. But I did bump up my at-plant nitrate just a little bit. What am I running? About 45, 50 units with my planter now.
Okay.
45, I think, something like that. And then side dressing the nitrate after we get a little bit of height on our corn. And we are running some nitrate through irrigation.
Okay.
And adding again pre-tassel.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't know, that's one thing we need to work at. Where are we at on that? Do we need to lessen that we're putting out side dress and increase what we're putting out pre-tassel?
Yeah. And that's what me and you kind of discussed. Actually, I didn't mention it in my little slideshow, but another one of the cover crop things on fertility wise that we're trying to look at Mississippi State and in my program is this year. So we want to really trying to separate it by species to have a baseline, But basically, what we did this year is we have a grass cover crop species, crimson clover planted cover crop species, and then we have no cover crop. And within that, we're going to try and look at different nitrogen rates. I showed some of the previous research said you actually need more nitrogen in one of those grass species, and maybe all that carbon out there can tie it up, especially, as we get these heavier rains and things like that here in the Mid-South, especially on corn crops early in the year, we've got that nitrogen out there. It could be good to have the organic matter that we certainly don't have in most of our soils to be able to hold that there. So, we're trying to look at, do we need more? Could we cut back from that clover and things of that nature? And I think, we want to build on that and get to where you're talking about, throughout the year, and, a lot of stuff we've done is a split application is still what Mississippi State recommends and what I would recommend now, but do we need to rethink kind of the amounts on those split applications with the cover crops and things of that nature? So I think that's all goes back to the fertility aspect and, how these cover crops might affect it. And I think it's something we're learning and I know you're learning as well. And, but obviously, we appreciate that. And hopefully we'll have some better answers here in the future about that kind of stuff, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's ongoing research for us on the farm, and that's something where Justin can really help us out in the future, starting to do some of that small things that it's a little bit hard to do on a large farm scale to really test it out.
Well, that's what we're going to try to get to. I know that we don't. I feel like at least in my program, as far as cover crops go, we're new. You've been doing it for 28 years, so it's pretty impressive how far, I guess, ahead of us you probably are on that sense. But we want to make sure that the things we've learned in the past, how do we take what we learn and then apply it into these cover crop systems and really move into not only a profitable but sustainable agriculture systems here in this area. And one of the things with that is, it kind of touched on the crop rotation and not having a lagoon, so I know that you're cotton and corn and you talked about, your yields, behind one another kind of in your thing. I know it's mostly done from an economical standpoint on your end, but, do you feel that having those cover crops in there have really allowed you to do that? Not have that legume, say soybeans or something else in the mix as your cash crop rotation,
So, my answer, Justin, would absolutely that has helped me. If I'm looking at my yields over time, over the past 20 years, some of that's variety for sure, but some of it is agronomics where we're making these changes. And I think the cover crops is giving us that something different in there through the winter and carrying them longer. My cotton, I'm not burning that down till, say, April 15th, somewhere along in that time span, 10th through the 25th of April. Is what we're shooting for. Yeah. And I feel like I've got a second crop growing out there, not cotton and not corn.
Right.
I think maybe for my own self, I need to try to work legumes in it a little more, the crimson clover or something like that into my cover crop to try to get that other crop out there some.
Right. Yeah, so that leads me right into, species. You talked a little bit about, I think you're mostly oats and rye with a little bit of clover.
Right.
I know you've been doing this for a long time, I guess. So, my question is, how did you get there? I guess, how are those just the ones that work for you, and what did you try before that really didn't work, if you have anything to touch on there?
Yeah, I don't know that I tried anything that just really didn't work, but I know just what I've been planting the rye, planting the oats. I've just, over the years, I see that oats is a little shallower rooted. It'll give you a little more growth on top early. Right. The rye, no doubt, especially since I've got drain tile, I can find rye roots in my drain tile pretty consistently.
Probably not.
Yeah, so it can be a problem. But definitely the rye is deeper rooted than the oats. And I'm working with the clover. I like clover. Whenever I've got a good standard clover going into a cotton crop, I'm seeing good yields behind it. I'm struggling with getting the clover. I'm not drilling. We're bedding everything, and I'm having a hard time figuring out a way about putting a drill in there. I'm broadcasting my seed on top of the ground. Yeah. But when I get a good standard clover, I really like it. I really like what the cotton looks like behind it.
Yeah. So you've been doing it 30 years, and you're still learning too, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't guess we'll ever quit learning. Yeah, that's the good thing about farming. Yeah. We will always be learning all our lives.
That's right. We hope not. And one thing you asked me about was your microbe stuff, and me and you kind of talked a little bit about that, and, wondered kind of, how we tell what's in there. And we talked about, fertility is all based back on microbes. If you remember, back in school, I mean,
Right.
you learn all these fertility cycles, right? And they all involve a bunch of bacteria and microbes to make these plant available. And me and you kind of discussed that, as far as right now, we don't know of any good test out there that's just available generally to the public to kind of decide that. Here at the university, there's some good stuff being done in labs on campus, but nothing is just a readily available test for say yourself, just to take samples every year and do that. But like you said, having that crop out there all year long, having something for those microbes, just the biological activity of your soils to continue to increase. I think, looking at it from a fertility guy standpoint, I think that that can be extremely important in making sure we've got the nutrient cycling we want. We are able to, obviously, when you get through organic matter, everything else is going to come. And we have such low organic matter soils. The higher we have, the more, those nutrients we're going to be able to hold at a time. We're not going to be able to lose to that. So I think that all that is really interesting. And hopefully, here, in the future, we can have a test out there that's, that can really tell, exactly what's going on quickly and available for somebody like yourself. So I think that's pretty interesting stuff. Did you have any other questions, Jack?
Yeah, one thing just was not information, but just for the future. I'd like to see Justin working more on exactly that. Those microbiology that's going on in the soil,
right,
in the different formats, and seeing what we're seeing. Because you can pick a good bit of that up in the Midwest and the northern states, but it's a different world what we live in down here.
Absolutely,
it's a different. We talked about that earlier. It's a different form program that we're using here than what somebody coming out of Indiana or Iowa or Nebraska is going to use. We've got a different climate down here than what they have.
Yeah.
So looking at what are our microbes doing with the cover crops and with the crop rotations and the different aspects of what we have, our different fertility programs, is pushing certain fertilizers helping microbes, or are we pushing a little too much and holding microbes back? Where are we at? And, I would love to see Justin do a little more of that.
Right. And I hope
tuning of it.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we hope to get there. Like I said, you've been doing it longer than I have. You've been doing it almost as long as I've been alive. So, but hopefully, in our program, I think I'm proud of, I've been there for a year. I'm proud that I feel like we're on the right track. We've tried to establish some long-term stuff, I guess I'm fertility background guy, so trying to do a lot of that. But I think, shifting all that in there, and, there's a lot of people on campus doing a great job with that stuff. So hopefully we can kind of meld all the two together and make sure we really have some good information, for yourself and, the rest of the guys that may be thinking about cover crops, trying to figure out a cover crop system on their own and really moving into the future. So I think that if this talk, I guess, taught me anything, is that I have a lot to learn,
Yeah.
But I appreciate you being able to spend the time with us today. I hope our viewers got something out of it. Again, Jack, thank you very much. Like I said, your operation was impressive that you had down there.
Thank you, Justin.
You're really doing a good job. Not only, some of the yields that you showed earlier were just, they're really good and doing a good job on top of that of having cover crops in the mix and, moving towards a profitable and sustainable system for now and for the future. So with that, I could go on all day. But my contact information is on the screen. If anybody had any questions, I'd like to again thank the Cotton and Rice Conference for allowing us to speak, for asking us to speak. Thank you for joining me today. Like I said, I learned a lot just being able to see that and talking with you here today. So again, I appreciate it. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to contact myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justin. Enjoyed working with you on this.
Yeah, me as well. I appreciate it. So.